Chapter 22. Near Station Bravo, 29 October, 6 o'clock p.m. The 6 surviving students picked a rise of higher ground at the base of a small tree. At this spot, they wouldn't get flooded out if it rained during the night. The tree was an ohia and it had gone into bloom, shining with red blossoms which glowed in the evening light. "We should make a palisade," Peter said. They gathered dry twigs and stalks of dead grass. They split the twigs and grasses into long splinters, then jammed the splinters into the ground side by side. This formed a wall of sharpened stakes surrounding their campsite. With the points of the splinters facing outward, they left an opening in the palisade, just right enough for a human to slip through. With a barrier of stakes around the opening in a zigzag to make the entrance hard to penetrate. They continued to work on strengthening the fort as long as there was any light to see by. They dragged dead leaves inside the palisade and used the leaves to make a roof over their heads. The roof would give protection against rain and would also conceal them from the sight of flying predators. They spread leaves on the ground under the roof too. The leaf bed kept them up off the ground, which was a constantly squirming bustle of small worms. They cut the light tent to make a flat top out of it, and they spread the top on top of the leaf bed to keep the surface dry and make the bed a little more comfortable for sleeping. They had made a fort. Karen brought out her spray bottle. It was nearly empty. She'd used most of it during the fight with the ants. It's got benzoquinine in it. If anything attacks us, there's a couple of shots left. I feel much safer now, Danny said sarcastically. Ricardo took the harpoon and dipped the point in the jaw of Kara. He leaned the harpoon against the palisade, ready for action. We should stand watches, Peter reminded them. We'll change shifts every 2 hours. There was the questions of whether to build a fire. If you were stranded in the wilderness at night, in the normal world, you would build a fire to stay warm and drive off predators. The situation was different in the micro-world. Erica Moore summed it up. Insects are attracted to light. If we have a fire, it could draw predators from hundreds of meters away. I suggest we do not use our headlamps either. It meant they would spend the night in total darkness. As dusk turned into night, the world was drained of color, fading into grays and blacks. They began to hear a pattering, thudding noise coming closer. A sound of many feet passing over the ground. "What's that?" Danny's voice rose in a quaver. A herd of ghostly, delicate animals appeared and wandered past the camp. They were daddy longlegs, also called harvestmen, 8-legged creatures, walking on spindly legs that seemed impossibly long. From the point of view of the students, the legs spanned 15 feet. The body of each daddy longlegs was an oval nugget perched on the legs, and the body sported 2 bright eyes. The creatures glided over the terrain, tapping their legs around, looking for things to eat. Giant spiders, Danny hissed through his teeth. They're not spiders, Ken King said to him. They're opryons, meaning what? They're cousins of spiders. They're harmless. Daddy longlegs are poisonous, Denny said. No, they aren't, Ken snapped at him. They have no venom. Most of them eat fungus and decaying material. Detritus, I think. And daddy longlegs are beautiful. To me, they're the giraffes of the micro-world. Only an arachnologist would say that, Ricardo said to her. The herd of daddy longlegs moved on, and the noises of their pattering feet faded. The darkness thickened and filled the forest like a rising tide. The sounds of the forest became different. It meant that a whole new set of creatures was coming out. It's the changing of the guard, Karen King's voice came out of dimness. The new shift will be hungry. They couldn't see one another clearly now. As the night advanced, the noises rose up and grew stronger, more insistent, swirling around them. From near and far came screeching, booming, wailing, tapping, whistling, thresh-out, growling, and pulsing sounds. The humans could feel vibrations running through the ground, too. For some insects communicated by tapping on the ground or on a surface. The students couldn't understand a word of it. They curled up next to one another, while Amar Singh took the first watch, holding the harpoon. He climbed up on the leaf roof of the fort, where he sat bolt upright, listening and sniffing the air. The air was thick with pheromones. I don't know what I'm smelling, he confessed. It's all strange to me. Emma began to wonder how they were able to smell anything. Their bodies had been shrunken by a factor of 100, presumably. This meant that the atoms in their bodies were 100 times smaller as well. If so, how could the tiny atoms in their bodies interact with the giant atoms of the environment? They shouldn't be able to smell anything. In fact, they shouldn't be able to taste anything. In fact, how could they breathe? How could the tiny hemoglobin molecules in their red blood cells capture the giant oxygen molecules that existed in the air they breathed? There's a paradox, Amos said to the others. How can the tiny atoms in our bodies interact with the normal-sized atoms of the world around us? How can we smell anything? How can we taste anything? In fact, how does our blood manage to hold oxygen? We should be dead. No one could figure it out. Maybe Kingsky would have had an answer, Rick said. Maybe not, Peter said. I get the idea Nanogen doesn't understand their own technology very well. Rick had been thinking about the microbends. He had been secretly inspecting his arms and hands, looking for bruises. So far, he hadn't noticed anything. Maybe the microbends are caused by some mismatch in the size of the atoms, he said. Maybe something goes wrong in the interactions between the small atoms in our bodies and the large atoms around us. A mite crawled over Amar, and he plucked it off his shirt and dropped it, not wanting to hurt the creature. What about our gut bacteria? We have trillions of gut bacteria inside us. Did they get shrunk too? Nobody had any idea. Emma went on. What happens if our super tiny bacteria gets loose in this ecosystem? Maybe they'll die of the bends, Rick said. A silvery glow had brightened the forest slightly. The moon was up and was climbing higher in the sky. Along with the moon came an eerie, booming cry, which echoed through the forest. Poo-ee-oo-oo. My God, what was that? Someone said, I think it's an owl. We are hearing it at a lower frequency. The hoot sounded again, coming from a treetop, and the cry sounded like a death threat, wrapped in a moan. They felt the owl's lethal presence, somewhere above them. I'm beginning to understand what it feels like to be a mouse, Erica said. The hooting stopped, and then a pair of sinister wings crossed the canopy in total silence. The owl had bigger prey to catch. It had no interest in anything as small as a microhuman. A creaking, whistling tremor shook them. The ground heaved. There's something under us, Danny cried, leaping to his feet. He lost his balance as the ground began to break apart, and he began staggering back and forth as if on the deck of a heaving ship. The others scrambled up off the bed of leaves, pulling out their machetes. While the earth under them groaned and trembled, Amar took up the harpoon, raised it over his head, his heart hammering in his chest. He was ready to kill. He knew it. The humans scattered, running up against the palisade, wondering if they should flee outside or wait and see the threat materialize. And then it appeared, a pinkish-brown cylinder of stunning size, rising up from the bowels of the earth, thrusting the dirt before it. Danny screamed. Amar almost threw the harpoon, but checked the thrust at the last moment. It's just an earthworm, guys, Amar said, putting down the harpoon. He wasn't going to stab an earthworm if he could help it. The gentle animal was just trying to make a living in the dirt, and was a threat to nobody. The earthworm didn't like what it found. It withdrew, sliding back down into the earth, and it traveled on, crunching like a bulldozer, while the palisade wall jiggled and shook. As the moon climbed, the bats came out. The students began to hear whistling cries, staccato sounds, and whooshing roars crisscrossing the treetops and gulfs above them. The bats' sonar. The noise was eerie, the sound of flapping predators using beams of ultrasound to probe the air for prey. A bat's sonar is too high-pitched for human hearing, but in the microworld, the bats sounded like submarines pinging the deep. They heard a bat zeroing in on a moth and killing it. The kill began with a lazy chain of pings. The bat was directing pulses of sound toward a moth, identifying the prey and ranging the moth, getting its distance and the direction it was flying. Next, the bat's pings sped up and grew louder. Erkamol explained what was happening. The bat is painting the moth with sonar. It is firing a beam of ultrasound at the moth and hearing the echoes that came back. The echoes tell the moth's location, its size and shape, and the direction it's flying. The pings gets faster as the bat zeroes in on the moth. Often as the bat was pinging a moth, the moth would defend itself with a loud drumming noise. Moths have very good hearing, Erica explained. The moth had heard the bat's sonar, and the moth was starting up its defensive noisemakers. The banging sounds were coming from drums on the moth's abdomen. The sounds could jam the bat's sonar, confusing the bat, making the moth invisible to the bat. As the bat closed in on a moth, there would be a crescendo of bat pings, mixed with a rising drumming sound. As the moth tried to jam the bat's sonar, ping, ping, ping went a bat, pom, 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 pom went a moth, trying to jam the bat's sonar. Sometimes a moth's drumming would end abruptly. The bat ate the moth, Erica informed them. They listened almost hypnotized as the bat sounds played over their heads, and then a bat passed right over their fort with a romp of velvet rings. The sound of the animal's sonar as it passed almost deafened them and left their ears ringing. "This world scares the hell out of me," Canon King said, "but somehow I'm glad to be here anyway. I must be nuts." "At least it's interesting," Rick commented. "I do wish we had a fire," Erica muttered. "Can't do it. It would advertise us to every predator out there," said Peter. Erkamol was the person who had advised them not to build a fire. But even so, the ancient human in her longed for fire. A simple fire, warm and bright and comforting. A fire meant safety, food, home. But only darkness and chill and weird noises surrounded her. She began to notice the sound of her heart thudding in her throat. Her mouth had gone dry, and Erica realized that she was terrified, more frightened than she had ever been in her life. The primitive part of her mind wanted to scream and run, even when the rational part of her mind knew it would be certain death to run blindly through this super jungle at night. The rational thing was to stay silent and not move, yet her primitive fear of darkness threatened to overwhelm her. The darkness seemed to coil around the humans and watch them. "What I'd give for a light," Erica whispered. "Just a small light. I would feel better." She felt Peter's hand close around her hand. "Don't be afraid, Erica," he said. Erica began to cry silently, gripping Peter's hand. Amos Singh sat with the harpoon across his knees. He smeared more kara on the point. Working by sense of touch, and hoping he wouldn't cut himself, Peter began to sharpen his machete with the diamond sharpener. They heard a whisk cling sound as Peter passed the sharpener back and forth over his machete. The others slept or tried to sleep. The sounds changed. A blanket of quiet dropped around them. The quiet woke the sleepers. They listened, straining their ears. The quiet seemed worse than any noise. "What's going on?" Ricardo said. "Take up your weapons," Peter whispered, urgently. They were clicking sounds, machetes being grappled held poised. Then a strange, soft whistling noise began. It seemed to come from several places at once. The whistling came closer. Something was approaching. "What is that? It sounds like breathing." "Maybe it's a mouse." "That's no mouse. It has lungs anyway." "Yeah, too many lungs." Peter said, "Get your headlamps ready. Turn them on at my signal." What's that smell? An acrid, musty reek filled the air. It grew stronger and thicker, until the smell seemed to coat their skin like oil. "That's venom," Peter Jensen said. "What kind, Peter?" Ken asked sharply. Peter tried to summon from his memory the odors of different venoms. He didn't recognize it. I don't know what. A very large, heavy animal began rushing toward them, making crashing sounds. "Lights!" Peter shouted. Several headlamps came on, and the beams crisscrossed over a vast centipede, rippling towards them. It had a blood-red head, studded with 4 eyes. Under its head, a pair of red fangs with black tips were held open around a complicated mouth. The centipede traveled on 40 legs, moving in waves, and its body was encased in segmented armor. The color of mahogany, it was a Hawaiian giant centipede, a scolopendra, one of the largest centipedes on Earth. Chapter 23, Fun Gully, 30 October, 2:00 a.m. The scolopendra burst through the wooden palisade, scattering splinters, while the people leaped and tumbled aside, screaming and shouting. The centipede had a keen sense of smell, and the human scent had provoked it to attempt an ambush. The centipede mistook the leaf bed for its prey and sank its feet into it as the humans scattered. With astonishing speed, it coiled itself around the leaf bed. Gallons of venom gushed from the fangs, splashing and filling the air with a foul odor. The individual legs of a giant centipede end in pointed fangs, foot fangs. Each foot fang is loaded with venom and can deal a sting. The Skolo's 40 legs hammered around, dribbling with venom. Amor had been sitting on the leaf roof of the shelter when the centipede crushed the roof. Amor fell down among the coils. He threw himself face down to the ground, trying to protect himself. Karen knew something about centipede and anatomy. She shouted to Amar, "Watch out for the legs. Each leg has a poison barb." Amar rolled over and began writhing this way and that while the foot fangs danced and thrust around him. Dribbling venom, he was going to be pierced by one of those feet. "Amar," Peter shouted. He advanced with his machete and began hacking at the centipede, trying to draw the centipede away from Amar. But the machete had no effect, only bounced off the armor. Amid shouts and crisscrossing headlamps beams, the others struck at the centipede with their machetes, trying to distract it and give Amar a chance to escape. Conan sprayed the benzo spray, but the animal didn't even seem to notice. The centipede suddenly let go of the leaf bed and began lashing its head back and forth, opening and closing its mouth fangs, looking to seize prey. It had poor eyesight, but could detect smell with its antennae, which it now racked around. An antennae slapped Karen, knocking her into the wall of the palisade. The centipede swung around and faced her. Amar, lying on his back on the ground, rolled away as the centipede turned on Karen. He struggled to his feet, still holding the harpoon, and shouted, "Hey!" That had no effect, so Amar jumped up onto the centipede's back. He stood on the armored shell, trying to keep his balance as it heaved around, holding the harpoon uncertain where to thrust it. "Aim for the heart," Karen shouted. He had no idea where the heart was. The creature's body was divided into many segments. "Where?" he shouted. "Segment 4. Emma counted 4 segments down from the head and raised the harpoon, but then hesitated. There was something magnificent about the creature. In that moment of hesitation, the centipede heaved its back. Amar drove the harpoon down deep into the centipede's back, but was thrown off. He tumbled to the ground, the harpoon still lodged in the centipede's back. The centipede whirled around, twisting and writhing, and its fangs snapped shut, the point of one fang slashing across Emma's chest, tearing apart his shirt and covering him with squirting venom. The venom drenched Emma. Emma curled up, moaning in pain. He felt as if his chest had been dipped in flames. The centipede went into a flurry, while the harpoon clanged around. Rick and Karen rushed in and dragged Emma away. The centipede uncoiled, coiled up again, hissing. The harpoon stood in its back. "Go up," Karen shouted. "Centipedes don't climb trees." They had camped at the foot of a tree, and the tree was covered with moss. They jumped up into the moss, grabbing handholds and footholds, and started to climb. Because gravity was less powerful in the micro world, they could climb quickly and easily. Amar tried to climb, but shooting waves of pain were running through his body, and he couldn't grip anything. Peter hauled Amar up, lifting him under the arms, and trying not to touch the wound on his chest. They quickly reached 2 feet above the ground, and they stopped in a sort of cave of moss, looking out and down, trying to see the centipede. The centipede was crawling out of the ruins of the fort, the harpoon raving in its back. They could hear it hissing. It did not get very far. It became still, and its breathing ceased. Emma had dealt it a fatal blow with the harpoon. Rick's kara had worked. They were huddled in a cave of moss, 2 feet above the ground, out of reach of any centipede. They had turned off their headlamps. Amos seemed to be going out of his mind. Peter and Karen held him, talking to him, trying to keep him calm. Emma was in shock, sweating profusely, but his body temperature plummeted, and his skin felt cold and clammy. They wrapped him in the space blanket. They also examined him with a light. The slash from the centipede's fang had laid open his chest to the bone, and he had obviously lost a lot of blood. He had been splashed with a large quantity of venom, too, which had drenched the wound. There was no way of knowing how much venom Amar had absorbed, or what it would do to him. Amar struggled with them, delirious. His breathing ran fast and shallow. "It burns." "Amar, listen to me. You've been envenomed," Peter said. "We have to leave this place. You need to keep still." "No," Amar struggled, while the others held him and tried to calm him. "It's coming. It's almost here," he moaned. "What is?" "We are going to die," Amar screamed. He fought to escape. They held him down, trying to quiet his struggling. Peter knew that the venom of centipedes had not been studied much by scientists. There was no antivenom, no antidote, for any type of centipede venom. Peter feared Amal might go into a breathing arrest. Some of the symptoms of centipedes envenomation resembled rabies. Emma was experiencing waves of hyperesthesia, feeling and sensing everything with too much intensity. Sounds were too loud, and the slightest touch on his skin made him cringe. He kept trying to pull the space blanket off his body. It burns, he kept saying. Peter flicked on his headlamp for a moment to get a look at Emma. Turn it off, Emma screamed, swinging his arms. The light hurts his eyes. His eyes watered with tears that streamed down his face. Though he wasn't crying. Above all, an unspeakable feeling of doom had gripped Emma's mind. He seemed to believe that at any moment something terrible would happen. "We have to leave this place," he moaned. "It's coming. It's getting closer." But he couldn't say what it was. "Run!" Emma shrieked. He tried to crawl out of the moss cave and jumped. Peter and the others struggled with him, and they held his arms and legs, trying to keep him from leaping from the tree into the night. For a long time, Amos Singh struggled and babbled, but during the early hours of the morning, he grew quieter and seemed to stabilize. Or perhaps he had exhausted himself. Peter took this as a good sign. He hoped Amma was turning the corner. "I'm going to die," Amma whispered. "No, you're not. Hang in there." "I've lost my faith. When I was a little kid, I believed in reincarnation. Now I know there's nothing after death. It's the venom talking, Emma. I've hurt so many people in my life. No way to make it up now. Come on, Emma. You haven't hurt anybody." Peter hoped his voice conveyed confidence. All of this happened in darkness, for they didn't dare turn on their lights. Erica Mole had been very afraid of the dark as a smaller child, and a fear of the dark roared back as he listened to Amma's frightened babbling. Amma's suffering hit Erica Mole harder than the others, and she began to cry. She couldn't stop crying. "Will somebody shut the woman up, please?" Denny Minot said. "It's bad enough with Amar going insane, but this sobbing is getting on my nerves." He began stroking his nose, running his fingertips over his face. Peter could see that Jenny wasn't doing well either, but he turned his attention to Erica. He put his arms around her and smoothed her hair. They had been lovers, but this wasn't love. It was survival. Just trying to keep some people from dying. "It will be all right," he said to Erica, and squeezed her hand. Erica began reciting the Lord's Prayer, Vater unser im Himmel. "She turns to God when science fails her," said Danny. "What do you know about God?" Rick said to him. "As much as you do, Rick." The others tried to sleep, The moss was warm and soft, and they were exhausted after the harrowing fight. None of them wanted to fall asleep, but sleep took them gently in its arms anyway. Chapter 24, Chinatown, Honolulu, 30 October, 11:30 a.m. Lieutenant Dan Watanabe sat at a table in an eatery in downtown Honolulu, called the Deluxe Plate, holding a piece of Spam sushi in his fingertips. The sushi was a bowl of fried rice wrapped in seaweed, with a chunk of Spam at the center. He took a bite. The seaweed, the fried rice, and the salty pork combined in his mouth into a taste that could be found nowhere but Hawaii. He savored it, chewing slowly. During World War II, whole shiploads of Spam had arrived in Hawaii to feed the troops. American soldiers had basically fought the war on Spam. Spam in an atomic bomb had guaranteed American victory. At the same time, the people of Hawaii had developed a passion for the canned pork product, a love that would never die. Dan Watanabe believed that Spam was a brain food. He believed it could help him think more clearly about a case. Right now, he thought about the missing Nanogen executive. The executive, Eric Jansen, had apparently drowned off Makapu'u Point when his boat had stalled out and flipped in heavy surf. However, his body had not turned up. Plenty of right sharks cruised the Molokai Channel, the stretch of sea between Makapu'u Point and the island of Molokai, and the sharks could have eaten the body. But more likely the body should have washed up around Coco Head, since the prevailing winds and currents would carry it that way. Instead, it disappeared. Then, shortly after Eric's disappearance, his brother Peter Jansen's shows up in Hawaii. And then Peter disappears. The Honolulu police had gotten a call from the chief security officer of Nanogen, Donald McKellar, who reported that 7 graduate students from Massachusetts had gone missing, along with a Nanogen executive named Allison F. Bender. One of those students had been Peter Jansen. The students had been in employment discussions with Nanogen. All 8 persons, including the Bender woman, had gone out for the evening and never returned. Don McKellar's call had been taken by the missing persons detail in the Honolulu Police Department. A report had been written up, and it ended up in the daily highlights bulletin that circulated through the department each morning. Watanabe, glancing over the highlights, had noticed it. So there were 2 missing Nanogen's executives, Eric Jansen and Allison Bender, plus 7 students. 9 people tied to Nanogen gone. Of course, people did go missing in Hawaii, especially young tourists. The surf could be very dangerous. or they went on a drinking binge, or they got so high on puna weed they seemed to forget their names. They hopped a flight to Kauai and went backpacking on the Naipale coast and didn't tell anybody where they'd gone. But 9 people, all linked to Nanajin, from different places, doing different things, all missing. Dan Watanabe took a swig of black coffee and finished off his sushi. He had an unpleasant feeling mixed with a professional curiosity. He could almost smell it. It was a whiff of probable cause, a scent of unrevealed crime. "We fell," the waitress Misty said to them, offering a coffee pitcher. "Thanks." It was Kona coffee, strong enough to put structures in one's afternoon. "Does it, Dan? We got a hopia chiffon pie." Watanabe patted his stomach. "Gosh, no, thanks, Misty. I just had my rations of Spam." Misty left the check on the table, and he stared out the window. An elderly Chinese woman passed by, hauling a wheelie basket full of her day's shopping, which included a fish wrapped in newspaper, the tail sticking out. A shadow raced down the street, darkening the people, a passing cloud. Then hot sunlight flared. Then another cloud shadow. As usual, the trade winds were driving rain and sunlight across Oahu. Rain and sun endlessly marching over the island. And when you looked into the mountains, you often saw rainbows. He put on his sunglasses and walked back to police headquarters, taking his time, running his tongue over his teeth, trying to work out a spam knot from between his molars. By the time he got back to his office, Watanabe had made up his mind. He had decided to open an investigation into Nanajin. Do it quietly. The matter was sensitive. Nanajin was a rich company with a high-profile CEO. The company might have political connections, who knows. The Nanajin matter would take time away from his investigation into the bizarre case involving the 3 dead men. The lawyer, Willie Fong, the PI, Marcos Rodriguez, and the unidentified Asian male. The victims had bled to death from numerous cuts while they'd been inside Fong's locked office. The Willie Fong mess, as he liked to call it, would have to go on hold. He wasn't getting anywhere with the Willie Fong mess anyway. At headquarters, Watanabe dropped by the office of his boss, Marty Kalama. "I want to look into these disappearances at Nanajin." "Why, Dan?" Kalama said, sitting back and blinking rapidly. Watanabe knew Kalama wasn't questioning his methods. Kalama just wanted to hear what he had in mind, his reasoning. Watanabe said, "First, I want to wait a short while and see if the missing people turn up. If they don't, I'll assemble a squad. But right now, I just want to do a little poking around on my own, low pro. You suspect criminal activity? I don't have a probable cause. But things don't add up. Okay, Kalama said. Explain. Peter Jansen. When I showed him a video of his brother, Eric, drowning, he seemed to recognize a female in the video who was a witness to the drowning. But then he, covers it up. Says he doesn't know the woman. I think he was lying. Then I had a couple of my people visiting Nanajan to get info on Eric Jansen, the executive who drowned. My guys met the CEO named Drake. Drake was polite, but my guys said it was like a traffic stop when the subject is visibly nervous, but there's no obvious reason for him to be nervous. Maybe Mr. Drake. Drake was upset about losing his executive. Watanabe said, it was more like he had a body in the trunk of his car. Marty Kalama squinted behind his rimless spectacles. Dan, I'm not hearing about evidence. Watanabe patted his stomach. Gut. My spam is talking to me. Kalama nodded. Be careful. About what? You know what Nanajan does, right? Watanabe grinned. Oops. He hadn't yet looked into Nanajan's business. They make small robots, Kalama went on. Really small. Okay, so a company like that could have contracts with the government. That's trouble. You know something about Nanajan? Watanabe asked his boss. I'm just a cop. Cops don't know shit. Watanabe grinned. I'll keep you out of it. The hell you will. Kalama snapped. Get out of here. He took off his glasses and polished them with a Kleenex. Watching Dan Watanabe leave. The guy was quiet and smart. One of his best detectives. Those were the ones who created the worst trouble. The thing about trouble was that Marty Kalama kind of enjoyed it. Chapter 25, Fungully, 30 October, 7 o'clock a.m. Morning came and the 6 survivors stared inside a pocket of moss on the trunk of a tree somewhere on a rainforested mountainside in the Kualu Pali. The birds were singing slow and deep. They sounded like whales calling to one another in the deep sea. Peter Jansen stuck his head out of the hiding place in the moss on the side of the ohia tree and looked around. He could see the remains of the fort on the ground below, trashed by the centipede. Nearby lay the dead centipede. Ants had already begun butchering it and had removed large portions of the carcass. They were near the bottom of a sea. Peter reflected it was a sea of jungle as deep as any ocean. He craned his neck, looking up along the tree's trunk. The tree was young and small, and its crown was ablaze with red blossoms as if the tree had burst into flame. I think we should try to climb to the top, Peter said. Why? Rick asked. Peter looked at his watch. I'd like to get a view of the parking lot to make sure we are headed in the right direction, and to watch what happens in the parking lot. Makes sense, Rick said. Peter and Rick pulled their heads in. The others sat huddled in the moss, with Amar between them, wrapped in the silver blanket. He had finally fallen asleep. A bruise had developed on the side of his head, extending over his left temple. It might be just a bruise, or it might be a sign of the bends. In any case, they decided that Rick would remain with Amar to look after him, while the others would attempt to climb the tree. There were 4 radio headsets, all told. Rick would keep one radio, while the climbers would carry the others. Peter said, "We should keep radio silence except in an emergency." "You think somebody from Netigen could be listening?" Karen said. "The radio's range is only 100 feet. But if Drake suspects we're alive, he may be listening for us, and he's capable of anything," Peter answered. They began climbing the tree. Peter led the way up to the first pitch. He put on the belt with the wheel and line attached to it, and carried the rope ladder from the backpack. Kenrick took along. Rick had his blowgun, and the box of darts, and the jar of Kara. Cameron would serve as the expedition's hunter. Tree climbing proved to be extremely easy. Mosses and lichens, as well as the rough bark, offered plenty of handholds and footholds as they climbed. They were strong enough in the micro-world to be able to hang from something with one hand, even by just a few fingers, and it didn't really matter if you fell. There was no real danger in a fall. You'd land on the ground unhurt. They took turns lead climbing. One person secured by another, with the wheel and belt down below, would lead the way up the trunk, carrying the rope ladder, which he would then secure to the tree and drop down to the others to climb. The tree was covered with furrowed bark, and the bark was densely packed with mosses and liverworts, tiny plants, some of them almost microscopic in size, though to the microhumans the mosses and liverworts seemed as big as shrubbery. The tree was also crusted with many kinds of lichens, fairly lacy and knobby. The leaves were rounded and leathery, and the branches snaked around. Eventually, Danny Manott gave up. "I can't do this," he said, and sat down and tucked himself into a lump of lichen in a sunny, warm spot. "Do you want to stay here while the rest of us go on?" Peter asked. "Actually, I'd prefer to be in the Algiers coffee house in Harvard Square, drinking espresso and reading Wittgenstein. Danny grinned weakly. Peter handed him a radio headset. Call if you have an emergency. Okay. Peter put his hand on Danny's shoulder. Everything's going to be alright. Obviously not. Danny tucked himself down into a frilly lichen. We can't just give up, Danny. Danny scowled and leaned back in the lichen and put on the radio headset. Testing, testing, he said into the radio. His voice crackled in the ears. Hey, radio silence, Peter warned him. Vin Drake, help, SRS. We're stuck in a tree. Danny shouted into his mic. Knock it off. I was only joking. Got a transmission. Johnstone bent over the radio locator. In the cockpit of the hexapod. Earphones on its head. He started laughing. Dumb bastards. They're calling Drake for help. His eyes moved upward, searched the canopy. They're in a tree somewhere above us. Telius grunted. A pair of binoculars hung around his neck. Telius stood up with the binoculars and began searching through the crowns of trees all around, looking for motion, listening for voices. The spies were somewhere up there. They were not going to be easy to find. He couldn't see anything. Then he silently pointed with one finger. Go this way. Johnson toggled the joystick. The hexapod responded by walking swiftly and smoothly across the forest floor, making almost no sound, only a faint whine coming from the motors on the legs. Telius was pointed to the base of a tree, a pandanus tree. Telius pointed upward, along the trunk. Up, he said. Johnstone operated a control, and claws on the vehicle's feet were withdrawn into sheaths, revealing soft pads covered with extremely fine bristles. They were nanobristles. The bristles, similar to the pads on a gecko's feet, could stick to virtually any surface, even glass. The hexapod began to walk straight up the trunk of the tree. Strapped in the cockpit, the two men hardly seemed to notice that the walker had gone vertical. They could barely feel gravity anyway. The climbers reached the top branches of the Ohio tree, and Karen King led the way up the final pitch. She crawled and walked along a high branch into a cluster of leaves that stood in bright sunlight, where she broke out into a magnificent view. The others followed her, and they ended up standing on a branch among the leaves. The branch swayed in the breeze. The Ohio blossoms, red and spray-like, resembled fireworks. The flowers consisted of a radiant explosion of red stamens, and they smelled impossibly sweet. The view from among the flowers took in the Manoa Valley and the surrounding mountain ridges. Around the valley, mountain flanks, cloaked in green and shielded by cliffs, plunged down from ridges and defiles veiled in clouds. Waterfalls threaded through rifts in the forested mountain sides. Tantalus Peak, the curving rim of a volcanic crater, looked down on the valley from the north. To the southwest, beyond the narrow mouth of the valley, the buildings of Honolulu rose, revealing how close to the city the valley was. Even so, the Nanogen headquarters on the far side of Pearl Harbor might just as well have been 1,000,000 miles away. Off to the southeast, they saw the greenhouse and the parking lot, a dirt expanse dotted with puddles of rainwater. The parking lot was empty and deserted. No sign of people or vehicles. At the narrow mouth of the valley, the access tunnel was visible, running through a cliff area. They could see the security gate. The gate was closed. Peter took a compass reading on the parking lot. Parking lot is on a bearing of 170 degrees south-southeast, he said to the others as he peered at the compass. Then he looked at his watch. It was 9:30 in the morning. The shuttle truck wouldn't arrive until the afternoon, if indeed it did arrive. But right now, the valley looked devoid of human activity. A thundering sound passed by overhead in the leaves. Instinctively, the humans ducked, grabbing at leaves and dredging themselves down. Peter went sprawling. "Look out," he yelled. A butterfly zoomed past. Its wings patterned with orange, gold, and black made booming sounds as the creature ripped and twisted through sunlight. The insect seemed to be playing. Then it hovered, wings thundering, and landed on an ohia flower. Droplets of nectar gleamed in the blossom. The butterfly unrolled its proboscis and sent it deep into the flower until the tip touched a droplet. They heard sucking, squishing sounds as the butterfly pumped seemingly endless gallons of nectar into its stomach. Peter slowly raised his head. Cameron was laughing. "You should see yourself, Peter. Frightened by a butterfly. It's, impressive," Peter said sheepishly. The species, Erica told them, was the Kamehameha butterfly, native to Hawaii. It fed in the flower for a while, poking here and there, while the wind carried a bitter stench to the humans. The butterfly might be lovely to look at, but it gave off a nasty smell. "It's a chemical defense," Erica Mull said. "Phenols, I think. The compounds are bitter enough to make a bird throw up." The butterfly ignored the humans. It took off from the flower and with powerful strokes caught the wind and soared outbound into the blue oceans of air. The butterfly had taught the humans a lesson. The flowers dripped with liquid sugar, just what they needed for energy. Karen crawled into the flower head first. She reached a glob of nectar and began scooping it into her mouth with both hands. "You guys have to try this." Her voice came out of the flower, muffled with stickiness. She could feel her body ramping up with energy almost as soon as she swallowed the nectar. The others crawled into flowers and drank as much nectar as possible. While they gorged on nectar, a movement in the distance caught Peter's eye. "Somebody's coming," he said. They stopped drinking and watched as a vehicle approached in the distance, coming up the winding road from Honolulu. It was a black pickup truck. It followed the road along the cliff edge as it climbed, and stopped at the gate in front of the tunnel. Here the driver got out. Peter, studying the scene with binoculars, saw the man take a yellow sign from the back of the pickup truck. The man placed the sign on the gate. "He put up a sign," Peter said. "What does it say?" Ken asked. Peter shook his head. "I can't see." "Is it the shuttle truck? Hold on." The man drove the truck through the gate. It closed behind him. Moments later, the truck emerged from the tunnel and descended into the valley and stopped in the parking lot. The man got out. Peter studied the scene through the binoculars. "I think it's the same man who dug up the supply stations. Muscular guy, wearing an aloha shirt. There's a sign on the truck that says Nitrogen Security." "That doesn't sound like the shuttle," Cameron said. "No." In the parking lot, the man walked around, scuffing at things, peering at the ground. Then he got down on his knees and started running his hand back and forth under a clump of ripe ginger plants. "He's searching the ground around the edge of the parking lot," Peter said. "For us?" Karen asked. "Looks like it." "That's not good." Now he's talking on a handheld radio to somebody. Uh-oh. What? "He's looking straight at us." Ken scoffed. "He can't see us." "He's pointing toward us and talking on the radio. It's like he knows where we are." "That's impossible," Karen said. Now the man went over to the back of the truck and lifted out a spray tank of some kind. He hoisted the tank to his shoulder on a strap and walked around the edge of the parking lot, spraying the vegetation. Then he sprayed the surface of the parking lot as well. "What is that about?" Erica asked. "Poison, I bet," Karen said to her. "They know we're alive. They've guessed we tried to hitch a ride on the shuttle. So they're nuking the parking lot, and I'm sure there's no shuttle now. They're trying to trap us in this valley. They're figuring we'll die here." "Let's make them wrong," Peter said. Karen remained very skeptical. "How?" "We'll revise our plan," said Peter. "How?" Karen asked. "We'll go to Tantalus," Peter answered. "Tantalus? That's insane, Peter." "But why?" Erica asked. Peter said, There's a nanogen base up there. There could be people at the base. They might help us. You don't know. And Jelikinski's talked about airplanes at Tantalus. He called them microplanes. Microplanes, Karen said. Well, I've seen a very small nitrogen airplane. And you guys did too, remember? I found it in my brother's car. Amar and I magnified it. It had controls and a cockpit. Maybe we could steal some microplanes and fly. Karen stared at Peter. That's completely, totally crazy. You don't know anything about Tantalus Base. Well, at least they won't expect us at Tantalus. So we have the element of surprise. But look at that mountain, Karen said to Peter, sweeping her arm. Indeed, Tantalus Peak dominated the view upward. A hulk of a volcanic cone blanketed with near vertical super jungle. It's 2,000 feet high, Peter. She paused and thought for a moment. For us, that's like climbing 7 Mount Everests. But gravity won't slow us down, Peter answered calmly. He had taken out the binoculars and was sweeping across Tantalus. He found a massive boulder sitting in an open area on the lip of the crater. That could be the Great Boulder. The map says Tantalus Base is at the foot of it. He couldn't see the base, though. It would be only a few feet across, not visible from this distance. He took out the compass and sighted a line on the boulder. It's on bearing of 330 degrees from here. Just follow the compass line. It'll take weeks, Karen said. We have a couple more days, tops, before the bends hit us. Soldiers, Peter said to her, can walk 30 miles a day. Peter, we are not soldiers, Erica groaned. I suppose we could try, Karen said. But what about Amar? He can't walk. We'll carry him, Peter said. What are we going to do with Danny? He's a pain in the ass, Karen said. Danny is one of us. We'll take care of him, Peter said firmly. Just then, Peter's radio beeped and started crackling. With a frantic voice, it was Danny calling. Speak of the devil, Karen murmured. Peter put on the headset and heard Danny shouting, Help! Oh God, help me! In the lower branches of the tree, tucked in a sunny spot, Danny Minot had fallen asleep. His mouth hung open, and he snored. He was exhausted after the longest and most terrifying night of his life. He didn't hear the clattering noise that approached him and hovered over him. As she helicoptered hovering, her expressionless eyes studied him. She was a wasp. She landed and advanced carefully. Lightly, she touched his left arm with her antennae, then tapped her antennae over his throat, his cheeks tasting his skin. The skin so pale, so soft, reminded her of a caterpillar, a host. From the end of her abdomen hung a long tube like a length of garden hose. The tube had a drill bit at the end of it. She took him gently in her forelegs and planted her drill bit in his shoulder. She thrust the bit into his flesh. It injected anesthetic. Then she activated the drill bit and drove the tube in deep. She began gasping, making sounds that eerily resembled a woman in childbirth. Danny was dreaming. The dream shifted. He was holding a beautiful girl in his arms. She was naked and gasping with arousal. They kissed. He felt her tongue go down his throat. He looked up at her, and her eyes were compound eyes, bulging in a woman's face. She clutched him, wouldn't let go. He woke with a start. Ugh! He was staring into the eyes of a giant wasp. The wasp was holding him tight, gripping him with her legs, and burying her stinger in his shoulder. And he felt nothing. His arm had gone dead. No, he screamed, and grabbed the stinger in both hands, and tried to pull it out. But then the wasp pulled its stinger out of his shoulder anyway, and let go of him, and flew away. He rolled over on his back, clutching his arm. Help! The arm had become a nothingness, hanging from his shoulder, a dead weight with no feeling in it, as if it had been pumped full of Novocaine. He noticed a small hole in his shirt, with dark redness spreading in the cloth. Blood. He tore open his shirt and stared at a hole in his shoulder. It was as neat and round as a drill hole, and it oozed blood. There was no sensations of pain, nothing. He clutched for the headset. Help! Oh God, help! He shouted. Danny, Peter's voice came on. Something stung me. Oh my God. What stung you? I can't feel it. It's dead. What's dead? My arm. It was so big. His voice ran up into whimpering terror. Ricardo's voice came on. What's happening? He was calling from the moss cave, lower on the tree, where he had stayed with Amar Singh. Denny's been stung, Peter said. Denny, stay where you are. I'm coming down to you. I fought it off. Good. Denny hunched up, not wanting to look at his shoulder. The blood oozed into his shirt. He felt his forehead. Did he have a fever? Was he getting delirious? He began muttering, No poison. I'm fine. No poison. No poison. No poison. Peter took the first aid kit with him. Descent was easy and quick. He let himself down, hand over hand, sometimes hanging by one hand. He found Danny curled up in a fetal position, his face drained of color. His left arm seemed limp. I can't feel my arm, Danny whimpered. Peter pulled open Danny's shirt and inspected the wound on his shoulder. It was a small puncture wound. He cleaned it with an iodine swab, expecting Danny to feel a sting from the swab, but Danny felt nothing. Peter searched for signs of envenomations. He stared into Danny's eyes, looking for constrictions or dilations of the pupils. His eyes seemed normal. He took Danny's pulse, noted his respiration, and looked for changes in skin color or mental state. Danny seemed very frightened. Peter inspected Danny's arm. The skin had a normal color, but the arm was limp. He pinched the arm. "Did you feel that?" Danny shook his head. "Nausea? Pain?" he asked Danny. "No poison, no poison." "I don't think you've been envenomed." If there had been venom in the sting, then Danny would be extremely sick, with severe pain, or even dead. But his vital signs remained stable. "I think you scared it away." "What was it anyway? A bee or a wasp?" Danny muttered. "I don't know." Wasps were much more common than bees. Hawaii probably had thousands of different kinds of wasps, many of them unnamed and unidentified. There was no telling what kind of wasp had stung Danny, if it had been a wasp at all. Peter opened a band-aid and placed it over the puncture in Danny's shoulder. Then he tore off the sleeve of his own shirt and turned it into a makeshift arm sling for Danny. He wondered how to get Danny down to the ground. "Do you feel able to jump?" "No, maybe. It won't hurt us." Then Peter called on the radio to Karen King and Erica Mole, who was still at the top of the tree. "Danny and I are going to jump to the ground. You might as well do the same." Karen and Erica leaned out from a cluster of leaves. They couldn't see the ground. Karen glanced at Erica, who nodded. "We're cool," Karen said on the radio, and she checked to make sure the blowgun was strapped tightly to her back. 1, 2, 3. Erica jumped first, Karen following moments later. As she fell into space, Karen spread-eagled herself like a skydiver. She went into a glide. "Wow!" she shouted. She could see Erica falling below her, and Erica was shouting. They were gliding, and it was controllable. Karen moved her legs and arms and went off at a slant. She could feel the air flowing over her body, thick and soft, supporting her rate. This was like body surfing, except it was in air rather than water. She slammed into a branch and tumbled into space, unhurt, and spread her arms again, and surfed the liquid wind, descending through the tree. She saw Erica diving at an angle below her. Erica had gotten ahead of her, was falling faster. Karen wanted to slow herself down. She rolled her body leftward and rightward, catching the air and using her arms and legs to slow her fall. "Whew!" she yelled. Leaves were coming. She had lost sight of Erica. She heard Erica scream. She burst through the leaves and a spider web lay dead ahead. Erica was trapped in it, bouncing up and down, thrashing her arms and legs, trying to escape. A pale green spider clung to the edges of the web. A crab spider, very poisonous. Karen rolled her body sideways as she fell, her knowledge of this spider flashing through her mind. She needed to fall into the web. It was the only way to save Erica. Gotta hit the web. She had no fear. She could handle a crab spider. She slammed into the edge of the web and hung there, bouncing in mid-air. To Karen, the web seemed maybe 50 or 60 feet across, far bigger than a safety net in a circus. Unlike a safety net, the web was sticky, its radial threads spangled with droplets of glue. She felt the glue soaking into her clothes, pinning her to the web, while Erica struggled in a blind panic, screaming for help. Trapped in threads, out of Karen's reach, the crab spider seemed to hesitate. Possibly it didn't recognize the humans as prey, Karen thought, but it would attack. She thought, and soon. The attack would come in a rush. Hold still, she called to Erica. She rolled herself over until she was facing the spider and drew her machete. "Yah!" she shouted at the spider. Her eyes moved rapidly over the web. She was looking for a trigger line, and she saw it. A thread running from one of the spider's feet across the spiral threads to the center. She flung herself across the web and cut the trigger line. The spider used the trigger line to sense the presence of prey in the web. Cutting the trigger line was like cutting a nerve. It also alarmed the spider. The spider suddenly fled, running away, and tucking itself inside and curled up, leave its home. "Most of them scare easily," Karen said to Erica. She cut another thread, and the two women fell free, while Karen called back to the spider, "Sorry, sweetheart." They landed together on the ground amid a tangle of sticky silk. Erica was badly shaken. "I thought I was going to die." Karen pulled threads of silk off her. "Nothing to worry about as long as you know the structure of the web." "But I'm a beta person," Erica answered. Peter and Danny landed nearby, crashing into leaves. Finally, Rick appeared, lowering Amma with the help of the rope. They gathered in a group at the base of the ohia tree, and Peter explained the change of plan. They would head for Tantalus. 10 minutes later, with Rick and Peter carrying Amma between them, they entered a fern forest, a seemingly endless maze of sword ferns, tall and dripping with moisture, arcing over tunnels that ran in all directions. Kura trees, olupia trees, and white coquille hibiscus trees sprang from among the ferns, twisting into the upper story of the forest. Peter sided with the compass. "That way," he said, and they began to walk down a long, winding passageway among the ferns. Fronds arced far overhead, covering the world in green. Danny was stumbling along when he stopped, stared at Amar Singh. Danny's eyes widened. He's bleeding. Nobody had noticed. Rick lowered Amar, and Amar sank to his knees, while a rivulet of blood trickled out of one nostril and ran across his upper lip. The blood began falling to the ground in a steady drip. "Leave me," Amar whispered. "I have the bends."